The Homefront is the name given to non-military activities of a nation during wartime, including politics, society, culture, and the economy. Life on the Homefront during World War II was a significant part of the war effort for all participants and had a major impact on the outcome of the war. Life during World War II was a very difficult time period for those who lived in major cities. For example, when Germany and the Axis power invaded the USSR along a 1,800-mile front in the Operation Barbarossa, civilians were deprived of food that eventually forced them to eat wallpaper thinking it contained potatoes. In addition, because of the constant attacks on civilians, much of Russian people's livelihoods were destroyed and they were left homeless and unemployed. Electricity was cut off, clean water was non-existent, and the only lifeline was wintry truck and train routes over frozen Lake Ladoga. Germans on the outskirts of the city shelled it constantly, adding to the horrific casualty figures.
World War II marks the turning point of the role of women and men in Russian society. As World War II began, many working men were drafted into the military, leaving the sources of workers to operate the factories. In effect, the factory owners began to change the role of women by hiring them as replacements. This led to the opening of new opportunities for women to have a role in the community. For example, women dug ditches, unloaded supply ships, and erected street barricades and other defenses in threatened cities. 800,000 Soviet women began serving in the Soviet armed forces. The Soviet Union was the only country in World War II to send uniformed women into the war. They were also responsible for taking care of their children and their household. By the end of the war, because the Soviet Union had the most casualties, the ratio of male to female was low. In effect, many women were allowed to keep their jobs and become independent from men.
Many Russians still had a low standard of living. They lived in crowded rooms and were malnourished because of the lack of fresh fruit and meat. Most importantly, the Soviet Union eliminated the feudalism system that pervaded the Russian society over much of its history, when they proclaimed all citizens equal. Now, Russians were no longer tied to the land, and the nobles allowed them to migrate to the urban cities, where the factories needed them. However, a new elite class still arose, whose members belonged to the Communist Party.
The Soviet government controlled all aspects of education, usually by requiring complete devotion and suppressing the people. They educated children through military tactics and added emphasis on mathematics, social and political science, and engineering. By emphasizing these subjects such as genetics were removed, scholars were purged, and textbooks contained inaccurate information and propaganda. In addition, they wanted to combat Russification through indigenization policy, which used non-Russian media and education. Every child constantly lived in fear, as Stalin ruthlessly killed any child that opposed him.
The Soviet Union was always an atheist state. However, many people still escaped to the church to profess their devotion. The role of religion in the daily lives of Soviet citizens varied greatly. 2/3 of the Soviet population were irregular to church. About half the people, including members of the ruling Communist Party and high-level government officials, conveyed atheism. In effect, for many Soviets, religion seemed unimportant. Before World War II, many ethnicities underwent killing thousands of monks, destroying hundreds of churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and other religious buildings. Although the Soviet Union destroyed many Russian churches, they still allowed St. Basil's Cathedral, which was influenced by Roman and Muslim art, to stand. Much of the art during World War II glorified Stalin and the leaders of the Soviet Union. One of the best-known official Soviet artists was Alexander Gerasimov. During his career, he produced a large number of heroic paintings of Stalin and other members of the government. Gerasimov's painting shows a mastery of classical representational skills. Russia is also famous for its Matryoshka dolls, which is a nesting doll. A set of Matryoshka dolls consists of a wooden figure which can be pulled apart to reveal another figure of the same sort inside. It has in turn another figure inside, and so on. The number of nested figures is usually 6 or more.
There was a vast variety of literature, such as In the War and Other Stories by Vasily Grossman, Volokholamsk Highway by Alexander Beck, that focused mainly on the war. In post-Stalin Russia, socialist realism remained the only permitted style. However, many writers, like Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, continued the tradition of clandestine literature. In addition, Soviet authorities put pressure on the Nobel Prize Committee to nominate the author they admire instead of authors that deserve the prize. For example, the committee denied Konstantin Postovsky the Literature Prize in 1965. Instead, the prize went to Mikhail Sholokhov, who was more loyal to the Soviet regime. However, later, the Serapion brothers insisted on the right to create a literature independent of political ideology. Consequently, this brought them into conflict with the government.